She only asked for a glass of water. Lena Jackson wasn't looking for a fight. She wasn't trying to start a movement. She was just a girl on a plane, sitting in first class, expecting to be treated like everyone else. But when the flight attendant looked her in the eye and walked away when her request was ignored. Not once, but twice, she realized this was never just about water. This was about power. About who gets to be seen and who is made to disappear. What the flight attendant didn't know was that Lena's father wasn't just any man. And by the time the plane landed, the entire airline would be scrambling. The headlines would be spreading. And one truth would be undeniable: she was not the one to be ignored. What happened next changed everything. Before we dive in, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And if you love stories that challenge the way we see the world, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Now, let's begin. Lena Jackson had been on planes before, but never in first class. She had never had the luxury of stretching out in a seat that felt more like a throne. Never had the privilege of watching a flight attendant pour champagne into crystal glasses as though it were nothing more than tap water. The whole experience, the quiet hum of whispered conversations, the effortless way the white-gloved staff moved through the aisles, felt surreal. She had earned this moment, or so she had been told. A reward, her father had called it, for her hard work, her diligence, her ability to keep her head down and do what was expected of her. But she knew better. She knew this seat had not been given to her out of fairness but out of power. Not her power, her father's. His name, his money, his reputation had bought her passage into this world. A world that was not made for her. A world that tolerated her presence but did not welcome it. And so, she sat there, quiet, observant, trying not to take up too much space. The flight had been smooth so far. The sky outside a vast, endless stretch of blue. Lena had settled into her seat, plugged in her headphones, and lost herself in the music, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. Not overtly, not with open hostility. No, it was something far more insidious. Something she had known all her life. The subtle, lingering gaze, the slight hesitation before responding to her presence. The way a smile could disappear in an instant. She had just begun to relax when she realized her throat was dry. It was a simple thing. A minor discomfort, easily remedied. She pressed the call button, watching as a flight attendant, her name tag read Miss Calloway, moved effortlessly through the cabin, tending to passengers with a polished, almost rehearsed warmth. Lena waited. She watched as Miss Calloway leaned in to laugh at something a man in a tailored suit had said, as she nodded attentively while handing a woman a fresh glass of wine. Then, finally, she arrived at Lena's row. Lena smiled politely. "Excuse me, may I have a glass of water?" Miss Calloway's face barely moved. There was no warmth, no acknowledgement beyond the flicker of recognition in her sharp green eyes. For a moment, Lena thought she had not heard her. Then, without a word, Miss Calloway turned and walked away. Lena blinked. She sat there, her mind turning over the moment again and again, trying to make sense of it. Had she been too quiet? Had she spoken too fast? No. She had seen the way Miss Calloway had responded to others. She had seen the way she had smiled. The way she had bent at the waist to whisper jokes to the passengers she deemed worthy of her attention. A few minutes passed. The ice in other people's drinks clinked softly as glasses were refilled. Lena pressed the call button again, her throat feeling drier now, her patience thinner. Miss Calloway returned, standing just close enough to be acknowledged but far enough to maintain a deliberate distance. Lena cleared her throat, keeping her voice even. "I asked for a glass of water earlier. We'll get to you when we can." It was a quick dismissal, cold and precise, and then she was gone again. Lena's fingers curled slightly around the armrest. The first time, it had been subtle enough to brush aside, to doubt, but the second time? The second time was a choice. She scanned the cabin. No one said anything. A few passengers had noticed. Some looked down at their laps. Others turned their faces toward the window as if the clouds outside were suddenly fascinating. Not one person, not the well-dressed woman beside her, not the man adjusting his cufflinks across the aisle, opened their mouths. And there it was. That silence. That thick, unshakable silence that sat in the air like a stain. Lena had seen it before. In department stores where she was followed too closely. In restaurants where the service was just a little too slow. In classrooms where her raised hand was often ignored. It was the kind of silence that said, "This isn't our problem." Her phone buzzed in her lap. A message from her father. "What's your flight number?" She responded quickly, her fingers moving before she could think. Within seconds, another message appeared. "Sit tight. Don't worry." She frowned. She wasn't sure what he meant by that. But she knew her father. When he said he would handle something, he handled it. But the truth was, she didn't want to wait for him to fix it. She didn't want this to be another moment swept under the rug. Another memory tucked away into the ever-growing archive of small indignities. She wanted to see how this played out. And so, she waited. Time stretched, elastic and slow. Miss Calloway continued her rounds, pouring drinks with a lightness that Lena knew would never be offered to her. The minutes ticked by, long and deliberate. Then, a man across the aisle lifted his hand. "Could I get another glass of water?" Miss Calloway nodded immediately, turned, and poured. Lena's chest tightened. She pressed the call button one last time. Miss Calloway walked past her without stopping. Lena spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me." Miss Calloway's steps slowed. She turned, her smile now gone, her jaw tight. "I told you we'll get to you when we can." And then she was gone again. Lena let out a slow breath, her pulse quickening. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't about being busy. This was about something deeper. Something unspoken but unmistakable. She felt it in the way the passengers shifted in their seats. In the way their gazes flickered to her before quickly looking away. They knew. They all knew. And still, they said nothing. Her fingers moved to her phone. "Dad, she's ignoring me again." This time, his response was immediate. "Stay where you are. I'm handling it." Lena stared at the words on the screen. Her father was thousands of miles away. How could he possibly? Then, the intercom crackled. "Miss Calloway, please report to the cockpit immediately." The air in the cabin changed. Passengers glanced up. A ripple of quiet curiosity moved through the space. Miss Calloway's shoulders stiffened. For the first time, she hesitated. She turned, her face carefully neutral, and walked toward the front of the plane. Lena sat back in her seat, her heart steady, her breath slow. Something was happening, and for the first time since she stepped onto this flight, the balance of power had shifted. Above the clouds, something was unraveling, and Lena wasn't sure what would happen next. But she knew one thing. This wasn't over, not even close. The moment Miss Calloway disappeared behind the cockpit door, the air in the cabin changed. It was subtle at first, a shift, a murmur, the way bodies adjusted in their seats, the kind of quiet that follows the first crack of thunder, when people aren't sure yet if it's just a passing storm or the start of something bigger. Lena sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable, but inside, her heart was beginning to pound. Her father had done something. And whatever it was, Miss Calloway wasn't going to like it. The passengers around her remained carefully indifferent, their gazes flickering toward the front of the plane before retreating into their own worlds. They had seen what had happened, had heard the clipped, dismissive tone, had watched as Lena was denied something as simple as a glass of water. Yet still, silence. A man 2 rows ahead shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Lena before looking away. A woman in pearl earrings who had been quick to chat with Miss Calloway earlier kept her eyes locked on the in-flight magazine, turning the pages too fast to be reading. They knew. They had always known. The refusal had been deliberate. And so was their silence. Lena exhaled slowly, tapping her fingers against the armrest. This was how it always happened, wasn't it? Not in grand, dramatic gestures, not in words spat with open malice, but in moments like this, small, insidious, easy to excuse. A delay, a dismissal, a quiet stripping away of dignity. She had been here before. In department stores where security followed too closely. In meetings where her ideas were dismissed until they came from someone else's lips. In classrooms where she had learned the difference between being included and being merely tolerated. The plane hummed beneath her. She stared at the cockpit door, waiting. Minutes passed. Then the door opened. Miss Calloway emerged, and something was different. Gone was the confidence, the smooth control she had wielded so effortlessly before. Her back was still straight, but it was stiff now. Her arms locked at her sides. The way she walked measured. Careful was the walk of someone who had just been warned. Lena saw it immediately. So did the passengers who had been pretending not to look. The tension spread through the cabin like a slow leak of gas. Invisible but suffocating, Miss Calloway moved toward the galley. Her face blank, her jaw tight. She reached for a bottle of water. And for the first time since the flight had taken off, she hesitated. She stood there for a moment, gripping the plastic too tightly, her knuckles pale. Then, finally, she turned. She walked back down the aisle toward Lena's seat, stopping just beside her, her posture stiff as though her very bones rejected what she was about to say. She set the bottle down on Lena's tray table with a soft, deliberate thud. Her voice was flat, measured. "Here's your water." Lena didn't move. She let the moment stretch between them. Let the weight of it settle. She could feel the eyes on her now. Passengers watching, waiting. Would she take it? Would she let it go? Lena tilted her head, looking up at Miss Calloway. Her voice was calm. "You served everyone else before they asked. You ignored me twice. And now, suddenly, I'm worth your attention?" A flicker of something frustration. Resentment flashed across Miss Calloway's face before she forced it back down. "It was a misunderstanding," she said. Lena let out a breath, slow, measured. She had heard that word before. A misunderstanding. The universal excuse. The man denied a taxi in his own neighborhood, a misunderstanding. The woman stopped at the luxury store's entrance, a misunderstanding. The teenager wrestled to the ground by police, a misunderstanding. It was always a misunderstanding. Until it wasn't. Lena straightened in her seat. "I don't think it was," she said, her voice steady. Miss Calloway's jaw tightened. And just like that, the balance of power in the room shifted. A few rows down, the older man in the navy blazer nodded slightly, as if to say, "Good, don't let her off the hook." Miss Calloway exhaled sharply through her nose. "Would you like the water or not?" Lena held her gaze. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, thick and heavy. This wasn't just about her. It was about every other person who had been made to feel small, invisible, unworthy. Slowly, deliberately, she leaned back in her seat. And then she said the words that made the air crackle. "No, thank you." A shift, a ripple through the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats. A low murmur, a reaction, quiet but undeniable. Miss Calloway's face flushed a dull, burning red. For the first time, she looked unsure. For the first time, she understood Lena wasn't the one on trial anymore. She was. And now, she had nowhere to hide. She turned abruptly, retreating toward the galley, her shoulders squared, her movements too sharp, too controlled. Lena watched her go. Then, slowly, she reached for her phone. A message from her father had already arrived. She apologized. Lena's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then she typed back. She tried. It wasn't real. The response came almost instantly. "Good. You don't have to accept fake apologies." Lena exhaled, rolling her shoulders back. She didn't know what her father had done, what words had been exchanged behind that cockpit door. But she knew this wasn't over. Because apologies were easy. Change? That was something else entirely. And from the way Miss Calloway had walked away, from the way the silence in the cabin had thickened, from the way people were suddenly more aware of her presence now that they knew who her father was. Lena knew. This wasn't just about a flight. It wasn't just about water. It was about power. And Miss Calloway had just learned what it felt like to lose it. But Lena wasn't done yet. Not even close. There is a particular kind of silence that follows humiliation. It does not sit politely. Nor does it fade with time. No, it lingers. It clings to the air. Thick and electric, demanding to be acknowledged. And in that first-class cabin, that silence now stretched across every seat, every row, every carefully averted gaze. Lena did not touch the bottle of water on her tray. She did not look at it, did not acknowledge its presence. The rejection had been final. And she wanted Miss Calloway to feel the weight of it, the weight of a woman who had spent her life making people like Lena feel small. Suddenly finding herself the one being measured. Miss Calloway had retreated to the galley, stiff-backed, her hands clenched into tight, pale fists at her sides. She was trying to compose herself. But Lena saw it, the crack in her confidence. The flicker of unease in her otherwise practiced posture. Something had shifted. And not just between them. A few passengers were whispering now. Low murmurs that barely broke the tension. Others stole glances at Lena. At the untouched bottle of water. At the door of the cockpit where Miss Calloway had disappeared just minutes before. Lena felt their eyes on her. She was no longer just another passenger. She was something else now, something that made them uncomfortable. Because she had done what they all understood but never dared to speak of. She had exposed it. The thing they all knew was there, lurking beneath the surface of polite society. The unspoken rules, the quiet understandings. She had called it out. And they were waiting to see what would happen next. A ding sounded overhead, the seatbelt sign illuminating softly. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice broke through the cabin. Steady and professional. "We appreciate your patience during today's flight. We are cruising at 35,000 feet. And our crew is here to ensure a comfortable journey for all passengers." For all passengers. It was subtle, but Lena caught it. So did the others. Miss Calloway had heard something behind that cockpit door that had shaken her. And now the captain himself, who rarely spoke unless necessary, was reminding everyone, in the most careful terms possible, that every passenger was meant to be treated with dignity. Miss Calloway knew it too. She emerged from the galley moments later. Composed but changed. There was no sharpness in her movements now. No crisp efficiency. She was watching her steps. She walked past Lena's row but did not meet her gaze. She continued down the aisle. Slower than before. As if every action had suddenly become a test. And that, Lena thought, was the beginning of the unraveling. Because Miss Calloway was not just an individual anymore, she was a symbol. A stand-in for something much larger. A system that had, for so long, operated in the shadows of plausible deniability. Unchallenged and unseen. But today, the light had found her. And she could feel it burning. The cabin had returned to its carefully orchestrated normalcy. But Lena was not fooled. She could sense the shift beneath the surface. The way the tension coiled itself around the cabin's decorum. Stretching tight like a rubber band that might snap at any moment. And then, it happened again. A man across the aisle lifted his hand, gesturing toward a flight attendant, one of the younger ones. Mia, the one who had hesitated earlier when Lena had been refused water. "Could I have a refill?" the man asked. Mia nodded quickly, retrieving a bottle without hesitation. Lena caught the way Miss Calloway stiffened, the way her shoulders twitched ever so slightly at the sight. She wasn't in control anymore. The hierarchy had been disrupted. And that, more than anything, was what was truly unacceptable to her. Because for people like Miss Calloway, it was never about the water. It was about knowing who was allowed to ask for it. Lena watched as Miss Calloway swallowed down whatever words she wanted to say. Whatever lingering defiance was still boiling beneath her carefully controlled exterior. It was slipping. And she knew it. Lena knew it too. She exhaled, slow and measured, and then quietly, deliberately pressed the call button above her seat. The sound was soft, barely noticeable, but it rang through the cabin like a gunshot. Heads turned, eyes darted toward her. Miss Calloway, standing near the galley, froze. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then, finally, Mia stepped forward. "Yes, miss?" she asked, her voice careful, uncertain. Lena met her eyes. "Could I have a napkin, please?" The question was simple, but its meaning was anything but. Mia hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." She moved quickly, retrieving the napkin and setting it on Lena's tray table. "Is there anything else I can get for you?" It was such a normal question. A question asked 1,000 times on 1,000 flights. But here, in this moment, it carried weight. Lena smiled, just slightly. "No, thank you," she said. Mia nodded and stepped away. But the moment remained, because Lena had made a choice. She had forced the room to acknowledge her presence, to recognize her as something more than just an inconvenience to be ignored. She had made them see. And from the way Miss Calloway's fingers curled against the edge of the galley counter, Lena knew, the war was far from over. It had only just begun. There is a moment in every conflict, sometimes loud, sometimes silent, where the tide turns. It is not always a moment of grand defiance or violent outburst. Sometimes, it is something quieter, something slower, a crack in the foundation, a misstep from someone who, until that moment, believed themselves untouchable. Lena could feel it coming. She sat still, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her breathing even. The tension in the first-class cabin had tightened like a drawn bowstring, stretched to the point of snapping. It was no longer just a matter of discomfort. Something had shifted. The war that had been silent, that had existed only in glances and denials, was now playing out in real time, in front of an audience that had no choice but to see it. Miss Calloway had made sure of that, because in her attempt to pretend Lena did not exist, she had done the opposite. Now, every passenger in that cabin had a choice: to ignore what was happening, or to acknowledge it, and the very act of choosing was an indictment in itself. Lena's call button still glowed softly above her seat. A harmless thing, a small thing, and yet, in this moment, it had become a beacon. A quiet, undeniable declaration. I am here. You will see me. You will hear me. Miss Calloway had seen it, had heard it, and still she did not move. Mia had answered Lena's last request. But there was an unspoken rule among flight attendants. One that everyone in the industry understood: when a senior attendant was present, it was their duty to respond first. Miss Calloway should have been the one to step forward. And she hadn't. She was holding the line, refusing to yield, because that was the thing about power people who had it never gave it up willingly. Lena had spent her whole life watching them clutch it with desperate fingers. Watching them bend and twist and contort reality just to keep their grip intact. She had seen it in schools, when teachers refused to call on her no matter how many times she raised her hand. She had seen it in banks, when loan officers used words like unqualified and not the right fit while glancing at her last name. She had seen it in corporate boardrooms, where her father had built his empire brick by brick, only to have white men in expensive suits pretend they had given it to him. And she was seeing it now. In real time, above the clouds. Mia had barely finished responding to Lena's request when the intercom crackled again. Miss Calloway, please report to the front of the cabin. Immediately. Not the cockpit this time. The front of the cabin. Which meant someone was waiting for her. Which meant someone was watching. Miss Calloway's spine stiffened. For the first time, she hesitated before moving, as if weighing her options. As if trying to decide whether walking away now would be an admission of guilt. She chose wrong. She turned, and the moment she disappeared behind the curtain, the murmurs started. Passengers who had spent the last hour pretending they saw nothing were whispering now. She ignored her on purpose. Someone muttered, just loud enough to be heard. She's in trouble, said another, a man in a gray blazer. But Lena had no interest in whispers. She wanted to know what was happening on the other side of that curtain. She wanted to know who was waiting for Miss Calloway. And she didn't have to wait long. Because when the curtain parted again, it wasn't Miss Calloway who stepped out. It was the captain, a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the presence of someone who had spent a lifetime giving orders and expecting them to be followed. The whispers stopped. Completely. The first-class cabin, once buzzing with the quiet hum of comfortable conversation, had fallen into absolute silence. The captain's eyes scanned the room, calm but firm, and then he spoke. I want to personally apologize for the way this flight has been handled. Lena did not blink. The weight of the moment settled over her, thick and unshakable. Passengers turned in their seats, watching her now not because she had made a scene, but because a man with real authority had just acknowledged, out loud, that something was wrong. I've been made aware of the situation. The captain continued, his voice measured but clear. And I assure you, it is being addressed. There was no anger in his voice. No sharpness, but there was finality, a weight that told Lena, and everyone else, that this was not just about a single glass of water anymore. This was about something bigger. Miss Calloway reappeared then, standing stiffly behind him, her face drained of color, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles were white. She did not speak. She did not move. The captain glanced toward her, then back at Lena. His voice was quieter now, but just as steady. Miss Calloway will no longer be serving on this flight. A murmur ran through the cabin, an audible reaction. Miss Calloway flinched. She had spent this entire flight pretending that Lena's existence did not matter. And now, in front of everyone, she was the one being erased. The captain straightened. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. And with that, he turned and walked back toward the front of the plane, disappearing behind the curtain once more. Miss Calloway remained where she stood. Frozen, caught between the wreckage of her own making. For a long, breathless moment, she did nothing. Then without a word, without another glance in Lena's direction, she turned and walked toward the galley. Lena watched her go, watched the way the other flight attendants subtly moved away from her. distancing themselves now that it was clear she had lost. She had wielded power without question. And now she had none. She was alone. And for the first time, Lena saw something in her that she had not seen before. Fear. Lena exhaled slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the napkin Mia had given her earlier. The room had changed. People were looking at her differently now, not with dismissal. Not with the silent discomfort of before. No. Now, they were paying attention. Now, they saw her. And for some of them, that was the most terrifying thing of all. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. A black girl in first class wasn't supposed to make herself known. She wasn't supposed to be heard. She wasn't supposed to make them uncomfortable. And yet, she had. Not by shouting. Not by demanding. Simply by refusing to disappear. And now, as the hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin once more, she realized something. This wasn't the end. Not even close. Because if they had seen her once, they would see her again. And again. And again. Until it was no longer a moment, but a reckoning. There was a peculiar stillness in the first-class cabin. Not the peaceful kind. No, this was the stillness of something unsettled. The quiet after a storm. When the winds have stopped howling but the wreckage remains. Scattered and undeniable. Lena felt the weight of it. She saw it in the passengers who shifted in their seats, suddenly hyper-aware of their surroundings. She felt it in the glances that flickered toward her and away again. Uncertain, embarrassed, guilty. But most of all, she felt it in Miss Calloway's absence. The woman who had once moved through the cabin with an air of quiet dominance. Who had chosen who was worthy of service and who was not was now gone. Stripped of her authority. Pulled from the rotation like a malfunctioning part in a well-oiled machine. And yet, Lena knew this was not the end. Not for her. Not for Miss Calloway. Not for the passengers who had witnessed it all and now sat with the discomfort of that knowledge. The plane hummed, steady and unbothered, as though nothing had changed. But everything had. A soft chime signaled another round of service. Mia the younger, hesitant flight attendant approached Lena's row, her hands clasped carefully in front of her, her face unsure. "Miss," she said, her voice quieter than before. "Is there anything I can get you?" A simple question. And yet, behind it, Lena could hear the real one. "Are you satisfied now? Has balance been restored? Have we made this right?" But that was the thing about moments like these. They could not be undone. The past hour was carved into the fabric of this flight now. Stitched into the memory of every person who had watched it unfold. Nothing could be returned to the way it was before. Lena met Mia's gaze. There was something there, uncertainty. Yes, but also something deeper. Something that looked almost like shame. Lena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch. She wanted Mia to feel it. To sit in it. To understand that she had been part of this too. That her silence had been just as loud as Miss Calloway's refusal. And, to Mia's credit, she did not look away. Lena studied her for a moment longer. Then, finally, exhaled. "No," she said softly, "I don't need anything." Mia nodded once, almost as if in understanding. And then, just before she turned to leave, she murmured, "I should have stepped in earlier." It was barely above a whisper. But it was real. Lena let it settle between them before nodding slightly. "Yes," she said simply, "you should have." Mia swallowed, nodded again, then walked away. It wasn't an apology. But it was something. A ding from Lena's phone pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced down. Her father. "Sit tight. Security will escort you off the plane." Lena frowned slightly. Security? She could feel it now, the shape of something larger moving just outside her line of sight. Something bigger than Miss Calloway. Bigger than this flight. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself. Because if her father was involved, if he was making calls and sending messages, this was no longer just about what had happened at 35,000 feet. This was about what would happen when they landed. The plane began its descent. Outside the window, the sky darkened, the city lights sprawling in the distance. Lena adjusted in her seat, the seatbelt digging into her lap. The whispers had died down, replaced with an almost eerie anticipation. Even the passengers who had ignored her earlier, who had avoided her gaze, now seemed to sense that something was coming. And they were right, because the moment the wheels touched the runway, something in the air shifted again. The weight of consequence. "Ladies and gentlemen," The captain's voice filled the cabin. "Welcome to our destination. The local time is 5:42 p.m. Please remain seated until we have reached the gate and the seatbelt sign has been turned off." The usual speech. But it carried a different weight now. A quiet hum of movement spread through the cabin. Passengers stretched, reached for their belongings, eager to leave the tension behind them. But Lena did not move. Because she was waiting. And then, it happened. The soft hiss of the cabin doors opening. The heavy thump of approaching footsteps. 2 uniformed men entered the plane. Security. A murmur of confusion rippled through the first-class cabin. Passengers turned in their seats, craning their necks. The security officers scanned the rows, then locked eyes with Lena. One of them, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard, stepped forward. "Miss Jackson?" Lena's pulse steadied. She nodded once. "We've been asked to escort you to the terminal." And there it was. A hush fell over the cabin. Not because they thought she had done something wrong. No, because they suddenly understood who she was. The girl they had ignored. The girl they had dismissed. She wasn't just some anonymous passenger anymore. She was someone who had power. Not the kind that Miss Calloway had tried to take from her. No, the real kind. The kind that made people pay attention. The kind that could change things. Lena exhaled, lifted her bag, and rose from her seat. She didn't rush. She didn't shrink. She let them see her. As she walked past them, past the passengers who had pretended she wasn't there. Past the ones who had whispered in the safety of their own silence, she felt it. The discomfort, the realization, the understanding that they had watched something happen in real time and had chosen to do nothing. And now, they were the ones who felt small. She stepped off the plane. The security officers walking beside her. And there, just beyond the terminal doors, her father was waiting. And this was far from over. The terminal was alive with movement. A sea of bodies flowing in every direction, pilots moving between gates. Business travelers wheeling their polished suitcases. Exhausted parents corralling restless children. It was a place of transit. A momentary pause before people scattered to their destinations. But not for Lena. No, for Lena. This was not a transition. This was an arrival. She stepped off the jet bridge with measured steps. The security officers flanking her. Their presence making it clear she was not just any passenger. And then she saw him. Her father stood in the center of a group of sharply dressed executives. His presence commanding. His expression unreadable. Malcolm Jackson did not blend in. He did not lower his voice to fit into spaces that had not been designed for him. He was a man who had spent his life walking into rooms where he was not expected and making it clear that he was not leaving. And tonight, he was here to finish what Lena had started. She approached, the air shifting as she did. The executives, 3 men, 1 woman, stood stiffly, their crisp suits unable to hide the tension in their bodies. They were not waiting to welcome her. They were waiting to contain this. To manage it. To stop whatever was coming before it got out of their control. Lena came to a stop beside her father. For a brief moment, he glanced at her, his eyes scanning her face as if assessing whether she was all right. She gave a small nod. And then he turned to the executives. "I assume you understand why we're standing here," he said, his voice quiet but heavy. The kind of voice that left no room for misinterpretation. The silver-haired executive in the center, a man whose name Lena didn't know. But whose power was evident in the way the others deferred to him, cleared his throat. "Mr. Jackson," he began, his voice tight, controlled, "we received your call. We understand that there was an incident on board. And we take these matters very seriously." Lena almost laughed. Now, suddenly, it was an incident. A carefully chosen word. A word designed to minimize. Her father's expression did not change. "Tell me," he said, his tone deceptively calm. "Which part do you take seriously? The part where my daughter was ignored? The part where she was humiliated? Or the part where it took a phone call from me for any of you to care?" Silence. The kind that exposes people. The kind that reveals the truth that polite words try to conceal. The woman in the group, a younger executive. No older than 40. Her blazer pressed so precisely it looked like armor, spoke up next. "Miss Jackson was treated unfairly," she said, careful, controlled, "and we acknowledge that." Lena studied her. She had seen this kind of woman before. Smart, educated, the type who had learned how to navigate boardrooms filled with men who never took her as seriously as she deserved. And yet, even now, she was towing the company line. Because that was the thing about power. Even the people who should have known better still played by its rules. Her father tilted his head slightly. "Acknowledge it publicly," he said. The silver-haired executive's face tensed. "We intend to review our training policies." "No." Malcolm Jackson's voice cut through the air. Sharp and clean. A few passengers moving through the terminal slowed, sensing that something important was happening. "You're not going to hide behind policy changes," he continued. "You're not going to sit in a boardroom and draft a statement that means nothing. You are going to make it clear, in no uncertain terms, that what happened on that flight was unacceptable, and that it is not an isolated event." A flicker of panic crossed the older executive's face. Because Lena had just seen it, the shift, the hesitation, the unspoken fear of accountability. Because what her father was asking for wasn't just about her. It was about every other person who had sat in first class and been made to feel like they didn't belong. Every other black passenger who had been overlooked, dismissed, treated as though they were only there by accident. And these executives, these people who were used to controlling narratives, to smoothing over controversy with empty gestures, they were now backed into a corner. Because Malcolm Jackson wasn't asking. He was demanding. The silver-haired executive inhaled sharply through his nose. "Mr. Jackson," he said, measured, careful, "we don't want to escalate this into something larger than it needs to be." Lena's jaw tightened. There it was. The threat beneath the civility. The attempt to intimidate, to make them second-guess whether pushing forward was worth the fight. Her father smiled. A slow, knowing smile. "Oh," he said, his voice almost amused. "You think this hasn't already escalated?" The executive blinked. And then, before he could respond, Malcolm Jackson reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and held it up. The screen glowed brightly. A news headline. "Passenger mistreatment on major airline sparks national outrage." Lena's pulse quickened. It had already spread. People were already talking about it. She could see the executives processing the same realization. The woman in the blazer shifted uncomfortably. The silver-haired executive's jaw clenched. This was no longer something they could control. No longer something they could bury under a well-worded statement. It was already out there. Already growing. Her father let the moment stretch before tucking his phone back into his pocket. "Now," he said, his voice steady, unwavering, "I suggest you decide very quickly whether you want to be the airline that fixes this or the airline that lets it destroy you." Silence. Lena watched them closely. She could see it happening, the slow crumbling of resistance. Because power, when challenged, either reinforces itself or breaks. And in this moment, she could see them breaking. The silver-haired executive let out a slow breath. "We'll release a statement within the hour." Malcolm Jackson didn't blink. "Good." He turned to Lena then, his expression softer. "Ready to go?" Lena exhaled. And for the first time since she had pressed that call button, she felt lighter. She had not planned for this. She had not expected to become the center of something larger. But now, standing here, watching these men and women scramble to adjust to a world where they were no longer in control, she knew she would never go back to silence. Never go back to pretending. She nodded. "I'm ready." Her father placed a hand on her back as they turned away. The executives remained behind them, frozen, forced to reckon with a truth they could no longer deny. This was not just a moment. It was a turning point. And Lena Jackson had just made sure they would never forget it. The airport terminal felt different now. When Lena had first arrived, she had been just another passenger. A girl with a ticket, a destination, and the quiet expectation that she would be treated the same as anyone else who sat in first class. That expectation had been a lie. But now, as she walked through the terminal beside her father, she was no longer just a passenger. She was a story. And stories had a way of traveling faster than any plane. The first sign of it came in the way people looked at her. Not just the executives who had scrambled to contain the fallout. Not just the airline employees who suddenly seemed hyper-aware of their own presence. But strangers. A woman by the baggage claim, a middle-aged black woman in a navy blue dress, caught Lena's eye and gave her a nod. Not just a polite nod. Something deeper. A quiet acknowledgment. A man near the escalators, a younger white man in a suit, whispered something to his colleague. And both of them turned their eyes toward Lena as she passed. Some people looked at her with curiosity. Others with discomfort. Some, with quiet admiration. And then there were the ones who avoided looking at her altogether. As if by ignoring her, they could erase what had happened. It didn't matter. They knew. They all knew. Lena's phone vibrated again. She glanced down. Another notification. Another headline. Major airline issues public apology after first-class passenger mistreatment goes viral. She clicked on the article, skimming quickly. The airline's statement was filled with the usual corporate rhetoric: unfortunate misunderstanding, commitment to diversity, internal review underway. But it didn't matter how they spun it. The damage was already done. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was truth, forced into the light. Her father had done his part. He had made sure they listened. But the world was listening now, too. And that was something no PR team could contain. They reached the airport exit, where a sleek black car was already waiting. Her father's driver stood beside the door, nodding politely as he opened it. Lena moved to step inside, but her father hesitated. She turned to him, watching as he glanced over his shoulder, scanning the terminal one last time. Something wrong? She asked. He exhaled. No, he said. Something's just beginning. Lena followed his gaze. A news crew had arrived. 2 reporters, cameras slung over their shoulders, moving quickly toward the terminal doors. They hadn't seen her yet, but they would. She felt her pulse quicken. Her father met her eyes. This is where you decide, he said. Lena swallowed. Decide what? His voice was steady. Whether this is just about you, he said, or whether this is about something bigger. She understood what he meant. She could get in the car and drive away. Let the airline scramble to fix their public image. Let the news cycle move on to the next scandal. Or, she could stay. She could tell them what happened. In her own words, she could make sure no one else had to sit in first class. Press a call button, and wonder if they would be ignored simply because of who they were. She looked back at the reporters. They had spotted her now. A flurry of movement, microphones lifted, cameras adjusting. The moment had arrived. The choice was hers. She took a breath. And then, she turned away from the car. She walked toward the reporters. And just like that, the story became something they could never ignore. The moment Lena turned toward the cameras, she felt the shift. It was not fear, not exactly. It was the weight of understanding. Because this choice was irreversible. Once she spoke, once she put her voice into the world, there would be no retreating, no disappearing into anonymity. She would not just be a girl who was ignored on a plane. She would become a symbol. And symbols had a way of outliving the people they represented. The reporters rushed forward, microphones raised, cameras rolling. Miss Jackson, can you tell us what happened on the flight? Do you believe this was racial discrimination? Has the airline reached out to you directly? The questions came fast, overlapping, urgent. Lena could feel the heat of the cameras, the hunger in the eyes of the journalists. This was not just another travel complaint. This was a moment, a headline that had a pulse. Her father stood slightly behind her, watching. He had done what he always did, forced the world to pay attention. But this was her fight now. She took a breath, and then she spoke. I didn't set out to make this a story, Lena said, her voice even but firm. I was just a passenger on a flight. I pressed a call button and asked for water. She let those words sit in the air. Simple, undeniable. And I was ignored. A murmur rippled through the reporters. Some of them already knew the details. They had read the leaked employee reports, had seen the online outrage. But hearing it from her own lips was different. She could see it in their eyes. I asked again, Lena continued, her voice gaining strength, and I was ignored again. Meanwhile, passengers around me were served without hesitation. One of the reporters, an older black man with graying hair, leaned forward. Miss Jackson, what do you believe was the reason? Lena met his gaze, and she did not flinch. I think we all know the reason, she said. A silence fell over the crowd. Heavy, inescapable, because there it was. The thing everyone had been dancing around, avoiding, pretending not to see. She had said it without saying it. And that made it even louder. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A new headline had just gone live. Lena Jackson speaks out. We all know the reason. And just like that, the fire spread. Social media erupted. Her name trended. Debates ignited. Some people applauded her courage. Others rushed to dismiss her. It was a misunderstanding. She's playing the victim. This is why people like her don't belong in first class. Lena read the comments. But she did not react. She had been prepared for this. She had seen it happen before. To other people. To other voices who had dared to say what was true. Because the truth was not something people accepted easily. Especially when it forced them to look in the mirror. Hours later, as she sat in her father's car, watching the city lights blur past, she let it all sink in. She had spoken. She had told the truth. And now, there was no turning back. Her father sat beside her, silent for a long while. Then, finally, he spoke. "You did good." Lena exhaled. "Will it change anything?" she asked. Her father considered that. Then he nodded. "Maybe not today," he said. "Maybe not tomorrow. But you forced people to see something they didn't want to see. And once they see it, they can't unsee it." Lena looked out the window. The world was still moving. Planes were still flying. People were still boarding, still taking their seats, still pressing call buttons. And somewhere, right now, someone else was being ignored. Someone else was being made to feel invisible. But maybe, just maybe, the next time it happened, they would remember this moment. And they would know they weren't alone. Because one day, someone had spoken. And the world had listened.